Hello there, my name is Josh Hull. In this tutorial we will go through and use After Effects and Cinema 4D Lite, which is built into After Effects, to composite in a 3D object, do a little bit of motion on it, and make sure that we've got the shadows responding correctly and compositing it into After Effects. So we'll start off with a new composition, and I don't have a video for this, I just have a static image. We've already done a camera tracking tutorial, so if you wanted to use the shadows in the camera tracking, the process would be similar. Just going to import in this object, and here's our view. So for this one, when you're working with a static shot or not using camera tracking, you want to start by setting up some 3D objects which will act as placeholders for your 3D modeling. So I'm going to create a new solid. Just right click here and say new solid. Just say OK. And I will size it down to the size of the object that I want to place in the 3D space. Just imagine that this object is right in front of the camera. So I actually want it to be this small when it's, or about that small when it's in the space. But for the moment I'll make it much bigger. We can adjust this a little bit in the 3D software, or after having a look at what it looks like, but for the moment this is good. I'll just click this button which will turn it into a 3D object, and I will transform it back in the Z direction, which means it's heading away from the camera. Okay, so I want it to be about that big. So this is a placeholder for our object. Now I want a placeholder for the floor so that we can cast shadow on it. Can do that by going new and solid, setting it up similar to the other one. I'll make it 3D before I resize it. And now what I want to do is rotate it so it's, let's see, that way, nope, wrong direction. Rotate it to act like the floor. Okay. Bring it down, and what we're trying to do is recreate the vanishing point of this scene. So rotate it to the point where these lines appear to head off to the vanishing point, where the horizon would be in this view, in this perspective, to make sure that your shadow is correctly has the correct perspective on it. So I would say this is a double doorway, so it's not very wide. And let's extend it out a little bit further. And I'd say that width there is about the width of a double door. I might bring it down slightly smaller, slightly lower, sorry. And I'd say that's looking quite good. The better you get this point, the better your shadow will look in the 3D space. And now I'll just widen it out a bit. Now what we want to do is go into the top view and just have a look at where our object lies. So I've made this much longer. It doesn't matter that a whole bunch of it goes off into the distance behind the camera. So you can see that a whole bunch of it goes behind the camera. I want to make sure that the distance between this point here and the back, where the auditorium ends, makes sense for where the object is placed. So my object is actually probably a fair bit further back in the space. So I'm just going to bring it further back to about there, so there's a fair distance. Let's say this is the doorway that you're looking through. There's a circle, starts about there, and I want it in the center of the circle. So now if we go back to our active camera, I might want to adjust the size of this so that our object is the correct size when we bring it in the view. And that looks quite good actually. Now, like in the other video, I'm going to export, first I'm going to save this project. So I'll call it static comp. I'm going to open Cinema 4D Lite by creating a new file, which I'm not going to use, so I'm just going to call it untitled again. I'll just go through that process again in case that was too quick. You open Cinema 4D Lite by going to New, Max on Cinema 4D file. And because I'm not using this file, I'm going to open up the file that I just exported. I didn't actually export the file just then. So let's export all this detail with these two 3D objects to Cinema 4D file format. We can ignore that there's a 2D layer, that's the video layer, and I will call it static comp. Okay. So now let's go into Cinema 4D. I'll just call it untitled. And we're actually going to open up another file, the one that we just exported, rather than use this untitled. And as in the other video, I'm going to turn this tracking to camera off so that we don't accidentally move the position of the camera. This view will get exported to After Effects, and if it's in the wrong place, then it will, the rendering and the composition will be completely wrong. So we want to make sure that we turn that tracking off so that we can jump back to it before we save the file. Okay, so there's our object, here's our floor. We want to start to do a few things, so we'll bring in our 3D object that we want to comp in. Just use the same one as before, the polysphere. Just to increase its Phong angle a little bit so it renders better the edges of the sphere. And let's scale it up. It's tiny at the moment, so let's say 80 by 80 by 80 and hit enter. Still very small. I'll actually move it to the same position as our placeholder object so that I can get an idea of the size that it needs to be the correct size in our view. So there it is. Let's say that's about 15. Okay. So I can turn off my first placeholder object now. It's done its job. This one we will use as a floor, so we'll keep it there, but we'll set its material color to white. So tag, we go into materials, we go to color, and we can just set it to white. Okay. Now let's set up the materials of our object. So like before, I go to basic, the material view, I'm going to add a normal map, and then we set up all of the details of the different texture maps in these different tabs. So I will set a diffuse, we'll reduce the reflectance, and I'll set up the normal map. And if we hit Control R, we can see what it looks like. Okay. So let's go back to the starting view and save this, bring it into After Effects, and see what it looks like. So we import the file that we've just saved. And pull it down into the composition. We can turn off these placeholders that we created before. And so you can see that our floor is there and our object is the right size for how we set it up with the placeholder. So that's great. Now let's set up a light and a fill light. So a light for the top, which is a skylight, and a bit of a fill light for the ambient light that's reflecting onto it. And then we'll look at compositing in shadows. So let's, instead of a point light, we'll create an area light. Just turn off this again and middle click to show the different views. I want this area light to be a fair bit higher because it's a skylight which is much higher in the scene. So bring it up a bit, let's say there. And just let's set the size and shape of the area light. So we actually want the area light to be right over the object. So there. And we want it to be much bigger. And we want to rotate it. So it shines light down. I'll just render it, make sure it's working. Now to produce our shadows, we have to select the light, go to General, and in Shadows say either one of these. I'll just say Soft. Now if we render it, it should apply that shadow there, so we'll just move so we can see that a little bit better. Render it again, and you can see it's producing a shadow onto our placeholder floor, which is perfect. If we go into this view, you'll see this is a view that we're exporting to After Effects. You'll see that it's dark all around, so we want a ambient light. If we just set up an infinite light, and again adjust this level to provide the amount of light to fill in that bottom area. Okay. Now if we save this and go back into After Effects and let it update, you'll see it's producing the shadow. I'll just make sure that I set the render mode correctly. So in render settings we say standard final. And okay. So we have our shadow. How do we get rid of this placeholder object? All we want is our shadow applying to the floor. We don't want to see this at all. And I had a difficulty trying to do this before. I looked on a whole bunch of forums, and it wasn't the most straightforward thing ever. So I'll show you how to do that now. What we want to do is basically allow Cinema 4D to export the shadow channel, so just the shadow itself, and also a way of telling it that we only want to show this object. And in Cinema 4D there's a feature called a object buffer that allows us to mask out certain objects. So in order to make this object the one which is kept, we go to our object, we right click on it, say Cinema 4D compositing, and in this section here on object buffer, let's just turn on that object buffer. The other thing we need to do is at the moment it's just exporting a single image into After Effects. What we want to do is make it export a number of different images that we can then composite in separately and in different ways. So the way we do that is go to Render, Edit Render Settings. While we're here, we might as well set the anti-aliasing a little bit better, so we can set it to Best to produce a slightly better response. We turn on Multipass, and we don't change any of the settings in there. We just go to Multipass and add Object Buffer and Shadow. Okay. Now if we save that, go back into After Effects. Within After Effects, we want to be able to get access to those different channels. So we open up this setting here, the Multipass setting. We turn it on, so it actually renders with the different passes. We set the Multipass view to RGBA image, and we turn on defined multipasses, and say add image layers. And what that does is pull out the different multipasses from Cinema 4D into our workflow here. And there they are. So if we turn off those ones that have just come in, what we have is our starting image. And to get the shadow, we want to, well, okay, so we have our shadow channel here just by itself. And we also have this object buffer channel, which is masked out the object that we want to keep. The way that we apply that to our starting image is by going to track matte, and we want to apply the object buffer using the luminosity values. So the white will be kept and the black will be discarded. There we go, we've got our starting image without the shadow. And now we can just turn on our shadow and we've got the two together. Might make sense, depending on what sort of effect you want, to reduce the opacity of that shadow. And what I could do as well is on this shadow channel, we can add a bit of blur to make it look a little bit better as well. So I'll just ramp that blur up a bit. Play with the level of the shadow. It looks quite good. And I'm going to save this. Okay, so now let's say we want to add a little bit of motion to our object. We can go back into Cinema 4D, and Cinema 4D supports keyframing, like a whole bunch of different bits of software. You can record different positions and it will move between them. So let's start off, let's maybe rotate the sphere over the duration of the clip. So we'll start off this horizontal rotation, or H rotation, is the one that we want to do if we want it to spin on this axis. So let's turn on auto keyframing for the moment. Go to the end of the clip and say that in the duration of the clip we want it to rotate, let's say 720, so 2 rotations. Hit enter. And you'll see that it is correctly moving between those different values during the duration. If we save this, go back into After Effects. Oops. Okay, so what happened there was I didn't click back into my starting view. Which is why it's very important to make sure that you turn that on and off to keep the starting view before you move the camera around. Okay. So you see that the object is rotating. If you go back in here, you might notice we're not entirely sure the way in which it smooths into this motion. And say we recorded another type of motion at the same time, so we might have it start there, in the middle dip down a little bit. We've still got auto keyframing on, so it should be recording these positions. Then at this point raising up a bit. It's doing all of these, but the way in which it's moving between the positions, it's hard to tell at this point. So what we can do is go into, if we right click on the object and go to show F curves, we can see the curves of the different types of motion. So we are not doing B rotation or P rotation, and we're just changing the Y position, so we can delete those. Oops, like I actually just deleted all of the ones that I'm using. It's funny. Okay, we're definitely not using this. So this curve here represents the motion of the up and down. So it's a nice smooth motion. basically bobs up and down smoothly, but the rotation we don't want to be smooth at all. We want it to be continuously rotating at the same rate. So what we should be able to do here is if we right click, we select this keyframe here, which is the rotation, and we right click, we can set it to linear. And let's set that on this side as well. So I have actually had difficulty with getting this to, the problem is that because there are other channels here, we probably find that we're clicking on the wrong one, and we are. So, oops. So we'll delete the other rotation, and we're not changing the other position. So let's see, is this the right one? Yes, okay. This is why I deleted the other elements, because it's not always easy to select the right keyframe. If we go to this one and set linear, then now the rotation is going to be completely consistent, so constant speed, but the motion of the up and down is going to be nicely smoothed. So we can close that, scrub along here, and you should see that it doesn't slowly speed up, it just continues rotating at the standard speed. But the up and down motion is nice and smooth. So let's save that. Go back in. And from here we could render, save and render our composition. So we've got our shadows. Should see that as the ball heads closer to the surface, the shadow changes. And as it gets further away, the shadow should change again, get a little bit bigger as it gets closer to the skylight. Great.